All right, good evening. My name is Lee Hudson. I'm a defense reporter at Politico. Joining me on stage is the Honorable Eric Fanning, President and CEO of the Aerospace Industries Association. He's also a former Army Secretary. We also have Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill. She's a member of the House Armed Services Committee and a Navy veteran. Finally, we have the Honorable Douglas Bush. He is the Army's acquisition executive, and he's a former Deputy Staff Director for the House Armed Services Committee. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we're going to discuss the supply chain for critical infrastructure. Secretary Bush, I was hoping you could help us set the stage for the conversation and help us understand how the Defense Department defines critical infrastructure.
Sure, thanks. And so I studied for the test. I'll start out with the official Department of Defense definition, which is of course done by OSD. But it is systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on national security, economic security, national public health, safety, or any combination of these matters. So it's pretty broad, is what I would say. So I think that important recognition, I could maybe zoom that down one level to the Army. So for us, for example, what would be in that category? All the facilities and supporting infrastructure, for example, that goes into munitions production would be one. So this would be the factories that make things, the scientists, including those in Ms. Sherrill's district at Picatinny who design these things, but also all of the other capacity that goes into this system, from base chemicals to refining procedures to manufacturing. So all of that for the Army is an example of that critical infrastructure, but that definition is much broader, even just for the Army.
And in line with that, what is the latest threat worrying you in terms of critical infrastructure?
So in that regard, I think I'd put it in two categories. One is our ability to just make sure that our supply chains are secure for doing what we need to do to produce munitions for the joint force. So that's one. What does security mean, though? There is a physical security aspect to it. That means doing, for example, smart things like better cyber practices at our ammunition production facilities to make sure that critical machinery is not connected to the internet. It also, though, means understanding our supply chain down as far as possible, all the way down to base materials, like things you would find on a periodic table, that far down. And then working backwards to understand who owns those facilities, where are they, what kind of physical security risks they might have, but also what kind of business risk might exist. So there are different risk aspects to protecting supply chains, but that's how we're coming at it for those.
And what has the Army learned from Ukraine and now Israel in terms of protecting the supply chain for critical infrastructure?
I think we've learned that left to its own devices, economics drive to single sources of failure, because it is more economically efficient to get all of this thing you need from one place. That is the lowest cost place to get it. So the government's role is mitigating that kind of natural effect to make sure that we don't just have the lowest cost place to get something, but the most also secure place to get something, and also to understand that we also have other risks to consider, like where something is. You know, a production facility or support element in an ally is one thing, but one that might be in a potential adversary's country is an entirely different thing. So the government's role and the Army's role has been working with the private sector to find the balance between those two things. We want low cost, but we have to be secure.
And could you give us an update on ramping up production for 155 artillery rounds? Is the target still 2025 producing 90,000 a month?
So the ultimate target remains 100,000 a month by the end of next year.
Okay. Okay.
And we're on path to that. We're going to get over 55,000 by the end of the summer.
Okay.
And ramp from there. I brought some with my car.
Congresswoman Sherrill, from your perch being a member of the Defense Supply Chain Task Force, could you talk about a gap between DoD and industry in terms of information sharing And does DoD have all the information it needs from industry?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me compliment you. I did not think this would be the standing only room that I would encounter when we're talking about the defense supply chain, so wow. Yes, as you talked about, we had a task force a couple Congresses ago. Secretary Fanning was very helpful to really determine what the weaknesses were in our defense supply chain. And one of those areas that you just spoke about was information. Where were our supply chains actually going? We knew maybe we were purchasing things from U.S. manufacturers or U.S. suppliers, but where were they purchasing things from? Where were the rare earth minerals, for example, coming from, and who controlled those mines across the world? And that is something that we identified as a real threat, because as you can imagine, if, for example, one of our foreign adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party can shut down a critical supply we need to make those 155s, we're in a lot of trouble. And so we needed to make our supply chain more resilient, and we needed to close those information gaps. And so what we have done, and I remember, and I'm not sure if you were at that hearing, I remember one hearing where we were being begged, please, 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 there are great programs in the civilian world that can do this. Please don't let the Pentagon say they're going to handle this for millions of dollars and make some computer program that doesn't work as well. And so we put that directly into the National Defense Authorization Act, requiring that our military found ways to better help the suppliers, help the producers trace the supply chain, and we have seen really great results, so that you can go and there are programs you can put almost any subcontractor into it that can now trace all the way back, where does this come from? And so we discovered, for example, that antimony. So Picatinny Arsenal is the base in my district. We look at a lot of the supply chain from Picatinny Arsenal and where so much is coming from, and we found that that was sole sourced from China. And that was a critical mineral that we needed in our munitions supply chain. So we looked around, we found that there was an old gold mine in Idaho. We were able to start producing antimony out of that, but in a new way, so that it was environmentally safe and we could make sure the heavy metals weren't leaching into the soil. So here's a great source of jobs in Idaho, making our supply chain more resilient and doing it in an environmentally protected way. So these are some of the great results we've gotten out of that initial task force.
And Mr. Fanning, everybody talks about they discovered gaps in the supply chain because of COVID. What's changed since then? Could you weigh in on that?
Inflation in Ukraine. So we're relearning the lessons. I mean, I start by just saying it took us a long time to get where we are, based on assumptions and decisions that didn't pan out the way we wanted to. Same with Russia when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was dissolved, but also our hopes of how China might behave over time. So it's going to take time and a concerted effort to get us where we need to be on the supply chain, and that could include, will include investment on the government side, because there's not always a market for some of the things that we need to reshore or friendshore that will thrive on its own. So this is really where we need to get creative and thoughtful about public-private partnerships in order to boost that, especially where we know we need to do it quickly. Because we did learn in COVID the fragility of the supply chain, not just from a national security perspective, but from a broader economic perspective. And then we definitely learned it when Russia went into Ukraine. And to Doug's point, economics drive this efficiency, but so does the customer. This is an enormous defense industrial base, kind of has a single customer whose decisions shape that industrial base over time. And what we're realizing now is that capability, that capacity is a capability. And that's really a key way, I think, to bring resilience to the supply chain as we think about consistent, long-term demand signals to the industrial base to invest in that capacity and maintain that capacity.
Mm-hmm. And Congresswoman Sherrill, I know friendshoring is big, but so is Buy American. If you could weigh in on that, and if you think that there needs to be any changes to legislation to drive that point home.
We're constantly trying to fight a chicken and egg problem with Buy America. We have industry we very much want to build here, and capacity we want to build here. but some of it's not here yet. And so how do you make sure you have what you need in your supply chain while at the same time reshoring American manufacturing and growing the jobs here? And that's kind of a nuanced thing, and sometimes Congress isn't the most nuanced body that's ever weighed in on issues. So I think what we've done is we've put a stake in the ground. We said, and as far as demand signals, this is where we're headed. This is what you need to start to do. And I think it was necessary to really start to take a hard look at what we can do in U.S. manufacturing, what we need to do to be competitive worldwide. And as we go forward and figure out what are the limits of that, what can we do maybe in partnership with our allies, how do we create redundancy and resiliency, and how do we keep that supply chain going as we're growing our business here at home. But it is a struggle. We have had several struggles as we're trying to keep moving forward, like in solar panels, and some of the materials we need and some of the expertise we need, for example, isn't here yet. But we're moving pretty quickly, and I think we're seeing some good results there.
And Secretary Bush, how is the Army approaching that?
So first of all, the congressional piece here is critical, ma'am. So, and thank you for your leadership. So sometimes it's a mandate. We have one now from the recently passed NDA to get adversaries out of our munition supply chain entirely, all the way back down to base chemicals by 2028, and we're on a path to do that. But it doesn't just happen. We need resources. Congress has also quietly, and I think this is a huge bipartisan quiet success story, provided a lot more Defense Production Act funding for us to do projects to close those business cases Honorable Fanning was talking about, where the government puts some money in, then industry matches it with their mobilization of capital to make the business case for something to be either built here or to be built here with a new process that, for example, is more environmentally friendly. So this is that public-private partnership. The government has a role to play. We probably shouldn't be building the whole thing, but we have a role to play in helping make it a good thing for industry and a good thing for us. But we do need continued congressional support, but I'm cautiously optimistic about that because this has really been a very bipartisan issue, actually.
And Mr. Fanning, how is industry set up for success with this, or is there more that can be done with legislation or with help from the Defense Department?
I do think industry is set up for success, but there are limiting factors. And when we talk about Buy American, for example, Buy American can make it hard to sell American. I think we need to think about this in a larger context of our friends and our allies and our partners, which is always a part of our national defense and national security strategies, and something we have to a much greater extent than our adversaries have. And I think we've seen in Ukraine, we don't have the capacity and can't grow to the capacity to do everything we want in the United States. We need to do it collectively. For our industry, and I think for the country as a whole, when we think about trying to get manufacturing back, and I don't know anybody who thinks we shouldn't, that we exported too much manufacturing. I grew up outside of Detroit. You only need to go there to see the impact of having exported our manufacturing capabilities. But for us, a big limiting factor, and I think in this drive, is workforce. Where do we get the workers to do this? How do we train them? How do we entice them in very early ages to get interested in the different types of skills? Everything from well-trained, highly educated engineers to people who have to work very sophisticated machinery on the factory floor. So I think we're poised, but I think we need to be realistic about what we can do in this country versus what we should be able to do with our partners and allies, and also remembering that we also export products and sell overseas, and that's American jobs, and that's beneficial to our economy.
And to follow up on that, how's the confluence of Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, how's that putting stress on the supply chain, other than the workforce shortage?
Well, we went into COVID, certainly Ukraine, with a supply chain that had become very efficient, as Doug pointed out. Industry was returning the most it could for the taxpayer dollars that were given to it, not necessarily collectively thinking about what would happen if we needed to surge, or if the world were a different place. We were fighting two wars that were very different than what we're fighting now. And so we've had these layered effects that have shown us that we don't have the resilient supply chain, one that can expand quickly and surge quickly. And so each of these things layered on has just driven home that point more, which is great because there's more attention on this issue than there has been since I've been doing this. My caution is it's easy for that attention to wane, because one of the biggest problems for what we're talking about is it requires investment and requires resource in a stressed budget. Doug's working on the 26 budget right now in the Department of Defense.
Perfect.
Yeah, and purchasing power is going down. Someone said the other day, we're already operating like we have $1 trillion budget. We're asking the department to do a lot. And in the end game, I've seen it a number of times, when you're trying to get those trade-offs to get the budget balanced and get it out of the building, the things we're talking about now don't compete well against other things. So I hope that Congress, the Department of Defense, keeps pressure and focus on this, because we see how critical it is.
And Secretary Bush, how is the Army using artificial intelligence or other advanced technologies for supply chain security?
So the good news is, ma'am, we followed your orders. We are leveraging private industry's ability to provide supply chain visibility. So for me, that's at my program executive offices. So we've allowed, instead of like picking one for everyone, we've actually allowed our PEOs to use different ones. There's many good companies in this space providing really great capability. And I think that's helping us see the pros and cons of different approaches and different data sets. All of them use AI to some degree. So in terms of analyzing and scraping data from across the internet, for example, they all use it. They've given us, the government now, much, much greater visibility into all the things the Congresswoman was talking about, knowing where exactly everything's coming from. We relied on industry to do that, frankly, before. We can do that now ourselves by using this amazing capability that's in the private sector. And those capabilities actually can even do things like run hypotheticals. Like, okay, we've got our supply chain for artillery, but what happens if this one country, we're cut off from them? What happens if there's really bad storms in this part of the world? What might that do? It can go down into like the shipping patterns and understand how that would disrupt our flows. So this
has just come online. I mean, this is relatively recently that you've been able to do that.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
It's kind of amazing how quickly it's moving.
Yeah, but a lot of that is AI is underneath that. But it's giving us an ability to see ourselves in a way we just couldn't before. It would have taken people too long to do this.
And Congresswoman Sherrill, what other things would you like to see change regarding the supply chain, and how can you do that from your role in the House Armed Services Committee?
Well, it's really difficult. We've had a shrinking budget this year, it's totally true. These aren't always the issues that get the most attention when you're buying ships and aircraft, for example, but so critical. And I think so. We have cost issues. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't let that undermine some of the values issues that we have with our supply chain. Meaning, when you're in the military, you fight according to your values. You have international laws and rules that you find very important, and especially the United States, because that helps us with promoting our values across the world if we fight in accordance with them. But we haven't always had the same focus on our supply chain. So when we're talking about for example, things that come from Xinjiang, with the genocide being committed against the Uyghurs there and forced labor being used in our supply chain. We need to take a look at that. We can look at mines that are horrible work conditions, child labor, et cetera. And I think we need to use our understanding of our supply chains to create better conditions worldwide, and not just fight according to our values, but have all of our national defense supply chain be promoted in accordance to our values. That'll be a very hard thing to do, and and we need to be very cost conscious about it. But I do think there are ways we can do better now that we have all the information we have.
I wanted to see if you all wanted to each give a final thought for the audience.
Sure, I can start. So I think one thing, by the way, the recently passed supplemental is an example, though, of what we need. I mean, Congress answered the call and then some. They actually added funding to what we'd asked for artillery production capacity building and buying munitions. At the end of the day, not just build factories, you got to use them. So that is, at the end of the day, you need that to make the business case for businesses to want to invest themselves. But Congress did that in the supplemental. The The Army right now, we are $6 billion into industrial investments as part of our munitions ramp up across the board since the war started. That's been paired with close to $1 billion in DPA Title III projects. So we are putting money on the table in the department. We think these are just the right things to do. It's gotten bipartisan support in most cases. That kind of sustained commitment, as Mr. Fanning was saying, that has to continue. But I think we are showing that America can do this. We can secure these supply chains. No one's better than us at producing things. We just have to show the political will to get the job done.
I think that when we look to the future and look to this supplemental, we have to see the supplemental in all of the investment we've made using it into our own defense base. So while it's really critically important for our support of Ukraine, it's also critically important for rebuilding a lot of our defense supply base. We were looking at munitions facilities from World War II, environmentally damaging, really dangerous for the people working there, and not able to surge to the capacity we needed.
In the 0 seconds, I'm going to beat a dead horse a little bit here. I would never bet against American innovation. We didn't talk much about AI, but 10 years from now, all that leadership I think is going to be in the United States by far. So what can we do to help the private sector and the innovations that's coming out of there? And we've talked about clear demand signals and a stable funding process. If we can get the budgetary process, and no one suffers that more than members of Congress who want to do something about that, but if we can get a stable process in place, regular order in place, that will do a lot to help send that clearer demand signal to shore up and strengthen and protect and add to the resiliency of the supply chain.
Well, thank you for joining us. That's time for us.